Hey everyone! If you enjoyed this video, the full version is available on Patreon. I'll be uploading all my content there going forward.
Chapter 1 Notes: Luna enrolls a year early. Behind the scenes, the Demon King's growth. Gryffindor. Ethan White, with his short, jet black hair, gripped the edge of the table with both hands, staring incredulously at the unexpected guest before him, a large, fat owl with brown spots. It burst into the room like a whirlwind, circled once, then dropped an envelope, landed on the desk, and began pecking at the honey cream balls inside the box. The envelope was made of yellowed parchment, heavy with lines of address written in emerald green ink. Lancashire. The town of Sursk. Number 7 Willow Street. Mr. Ethan White received. Ethan quietly pulled the envelope closer, looked at the words on it, and then turned the envelope over. On the deep red wax seal was a shield-shaped emblem with a prominent capital H in the center, surrounded by a lion, an eagle, a badger, and a snake. Hogwarts? Really? Ethan muttered to himself, could it be a prank? He had lived in the small town of Sursk for so many years, always thinking that he had just been reborn in an ordinary foreign land. Before receiving this letter, he had already planned out his life up to the age of 25, and had even considered where he would settle down in the future. Ethan swallowed hard and opened the envelope. The parchment gleamed softly in the candlelight, and the handwriting on the letter was neat and solemn. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Headmaster, Albus Dumbledore. Dear Mr. White, we are pleased to inform you that you have been admitted to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Enclosed is a list of required books and equipment. The semester will begin on September 1st. Please reply by OWL before July 31st to confirm your intention to enroll. Vice Principal. Sincerely, Minerva McGonagall. Hiss, so serious, is it for real or not? Ethan still couldn't believe it, a dark glint flashing in his eyes. Hogwarts Acceptance Letter Exchange Value, 1, Magic Affinity. Ethan paused for a moment. Over the years, he had become accustomed to this exchange mechanism. He could gain attribute points simply by coming into contact with certain special items. This letter can actually be redeemed? That means, it's genuine? Magic Affinity, +1. Unlock Rare Attribute, Magic Power, Initial Value, 2. Unlock Attribute, Magic Affinity, Initial Value, 3. Unlock Attribute, Spell Resistance, Initial Value, 3. Ethan White Stamina, 5 Intelligence, 7 Strength, 5 Agility, 3 Magic, 2 Magic Affinity, 4 Physical Resistance, 3 Magic Resistance, 3. Random Potential, 0. Freedom Potential, 0. Random Experience Exchange, 76/100. Free Exchange Experience, 76/300. Ethan's heart started pounding like a drum. Strange, as far back as I can remember, I've never noticed anything unusual about my family. But since they sent me the letter, it means I have the potential to become a wizard. So, either there's a wizard in my family, or like Hermione, I'm just an oddball from an ordinary family. He suddenly frowned again, remembering a novel he had read before. It's 1991 now. I remember Harry Potter also entered Hogwarts this year, and then Voldemort started causing trouble, once a year. The first year, he killed Quirrell. Ethan scratched his head, a vague sense of unease creeping over him. Although the movie was fantastic and Harry's life was incredibly colorful, it seems that the people around him didn't have such wonderful experiences. Like the Weasley kids. One was disfigured, one lost an ear, one died, and another almost lost his life. Goodness, how many children does he have in his family? Ethan muttered to himself as he casually opened the second page of the letter that had been sent along with the main letter. The letter was filled with writing, and Ethan read it carefully, feeling a chill run down his spine. Work clothes, hat, gloves, cloak, 8 sets of books, wand, cauldron, so much stuff. Good heavens, how much did this cost? Luckily, Hogwarts offers free tuition and room and board, otherwise why would I bother going? The White family ran a small cake shop in the town, barely making ends meet and far from being wealthy. If an ordinary family were to suddenly come up with such a large sum of money, it would obviously be more likely that they would choose to send their child to a public school in the town. Moreover, the White family is not a wizarding family, and their attitude towards wizards is unknown. I can't just pin my hopes on my family. I have to work hard myself. I absolutely have to go to magic school. Ethan looked down at his small hands. Perhaps we could ask the school if they offer any scholarships or financial aid. Ethan couldn't help but glance at the large, greedy bird on the table. The fat bird was tilting its head back and swallowing the last piece of honey cream. Looking at the empty candy box, Ethan couldn't help but glare at it. Eating so much, aren't you afraid of getting cavities? The owl seemed to still have some more to say. It tilted its head and stared at Ethan, making gurgling, urging sounds in its throat. Oh. Yes. Reply. That's right. We need to write a reply right away. This is crucial to whether I can learn magic in the future. Ethan quickly pulled out a piece of paper, pondered for a moment, and carefully wrote down several lines. Dear Ms. McGonagall, I am deeply honored to receive my acceptance letter from Hogwarts and look forward to enrolling on September 1st. However, before that, I would like to apply for a scholarship from the school, for the following reasons. Ethan wasn't one to beat around the bush, but he tried his best to write each letter neatly and beautifully, making it pleasing to the eye. That way, maybe the other person would be in a good mood and agree to his trivial request. After writing the letter, he patiently waited for the ink to dry before carefully folding it up and letting the owl carry it in its beak. The owl, having received the reply, turned and flew into the vast night without hesitation. Ethan rushed to the window, gazing expectantly in the direction the owl had disappeared. Chapter 2. As the clock struck 9 in the evening, Ethan finally heard the sound of the door opening downstairs. He ran down the stairs like a gust of wind and spotted the beautiful lady changing her shoes at the door. Sarah White, Ethan's mother. Without a doubt, Ethan's lake blue eyes are inherited from his mother. Besides his eyes, his thick eyelashes, straight nose, soft eye sockets, and even the lines of his cheeks are all very similar to his mother's. Good evening, Ethan. Miss Sarah looked at the little one in front of her with great joy. Good evening, Mom. Are you the only one coming home? Because someone delivered a stack of urgent orders 10 minutes ago. Miss Sarah smiled helplessly, ruffled Ethan's hair, and said affectionately, but our little Ethan is going to high school soon, and we'd love to take on more of these rush orders. Ethan didn't rush to bring up the owl. He took his mother's hand and led her to the sofa, carefully choosing his words. Mom, do you know anything about wizards? Wizards? Witches? Of course Mom knows those stories. Mrs. Sarah took a can of beer from the refrigerator, her eyebrows dancing with excitement. Historically, Lancashire was a haven for witches. There were even real witch trials here long ago. Ethan's eyes lit up, and he quickly asked, Do you believe in wizards? I mean real wizards, the kind who can use magic. Miss Sarah couldn't help but laugh, laughing so hard she almost fell over. Ethan, please don't mind, because you've always been very rational. From childhood to adulthood, you've always used math, physics, and chemistry to explain everything you see. Your academic performance is also outstanding, even the prestigious Rogers School sent you an acceptance letter. I never expected you to be interested in fantasy stories. It's so adorable, honey. Ethan awkwardly dug his toes into the soles of his shoes. Miss Sarah finally finished laughing, and said seriously, But Ethan, you must distinguish between fantasy and reality. Like Santa Claus, haven't you noticed he gets fatter every year? Even Santa Claus was just dad in disguise, and wizards with magic don't exist anymore, the story is just a story. Of course, if you're interested in wizarding culture, when old John's circus comes to town again, Mom can take you to see their fortune teller. That poor old wizard has been a bachelor his whole life. Ethan remained silent. It seems that, like Hermione, her parents are ordinary people who don't have magic. He composed himself, not continuing the topic, and changed the subject, asking, "So, over the years, have you ever felt that there's anything special about me?" "Of course." Miss Sarah said proudly, "My little Ethan is even more handsome than his mother was as a child. He looks just like Bernie Anderson when he was young. Besides looks, my little Ethan is so smart. He's the only one in the whole town who got an acceptance letter to Rogers High School." Hearing the pride in his mother's voice, Ethan could only scratch his head. Although he had received an acceptance letter from a prestigious high school, he didn't really think it was because of his intelligence. The exam questions were indeed a bit difficult, but they didn't stray from the scope of basic knowledge. For a Tokyo University student who had passed the exam in his previous life, passing this kind of exam was a piece of cake for an 18-year-old lad. Plus, his good looks did give him an advantage. With his rosy lips and white teeth, he easily passed the interview as well. "Mom, I mean, have I done anything unusual? Extraordinarily intelligent? Child, ever since you were 2, you've refused to sleep with us no matter what." "That's because Dad's snoring is too loud, I can't sleep well." "But Mom heard that other children at 2 years old are still just wetting the bed." Miss Sarah gave him a smug look and continued, "And on your 5th birthday, the Ruma family came to visit, bringing along a girl named Amy, who's the same age as you. Little Amy has always wanted to share her dolls with you, but you insisted on teaching her arithmetic, to the point that she refuses to come over to our house anymore." Ethan vaguely remembered the platinum blonde girl and said helplessly, "She's so annoying. I was studying, and she kept bothering me." "Mom, I'm talking about something more special." Miss Sarah sighed, "Child, you have to understand, it's already quite remarkable for a 5-year-old to be actively learning math. If there's anything even more remarkable, let me think, it was probably when you were 7, old Jay's hunting dog attacked you, but you actually beat it to the ground. Thinking about it now, it really is unbelievable." Ethan's eyes lit up immediately. Miss Sarah continued, "Old Jenon left quickly with the dog, and if it weren't for the fact that he was a decent man, the townspeople would never have allowed the dog to live." Ethan had little recollection of this incident. But the fact that a 7-year-old child could defeat a hunting dog is unusual in itself. Ethan was certain that it was time to lay his cards on the table. He cleared his throat, picked up a dozen or so sheets of paper beside him, and carefully handed them to his elderly mother, saying solemnly, "Mom, I've found a very good boarding school. They have a 7-year integrated curriculum, and graduates have the opportunity to stay on as faculty or staff, or work in relevant departments. As you know, the economy is in a severe recession right now. There are more college graduates who have lost their jobs than cows on a ranch. From this perspective, I think this school would be a better choice than Roger High School." Sarah opened her eyes wide, wanting to refute, but after thinking about it, she really couldn't refute it. In recent years, unemployment in the manufacturing sector has indeed remained high. The government has also cancelled subsidies for many traditional industries, allowed various enterprises to be privatized, countless factories have closed down, and all industries have begun to lay off workers. This year, a bill called the Competition and Service Act was enacted, which seems to indicate an intention to completely abandon the manufacturing industry. The clever Ethan was clearly unwilling to work for the company for the rest of his life. What a terrible world! She waved the paper in her hand, somewhat annoyed, and asked, "What's this paper? On what?" The first article discusses some of the most promising career choices in England, where manufacturing is expected to continue to shrink over the next decade. The second part is a brief explanation of my personal views." Ethan said, "This was written in 3 hours. It has many shortcomings, but the general meaning should be clear. However, this is just the beginning. I will write more papers on this topic later, and I believe you will understand. I want to go to that school that offers a 7-year integrated education. Sarah stared blankly at him, first touching her own forehead, then Ethan's, and for a moment fell into deep self-doubt. An 11-year-old wrote 2 papers in 3 hours? Are kids these days being forced to learn how to write academic papers? God! This country is absolutely doomed. Miss Sarah suppressed her strange feelings and silently began reading the first paper. The paper begins with a brief overview of some social news, followed by an analysis of a series of real data, and even detailed trend charts. The writing is clearly very raw, but if the author were an 11-year-old child, this rawness wouldn't be so alarming. The article focuses on the significant impact that England's shift from manufacturing to services will have on individuals over the next decade. The second half addresses the current situation and discusses which career choices would be wiser in the future. Among these choices, Ethan offered very reasonable interpretations and personal opinions. Despite some formatting issues, the paper is meticulously organized, logically connected, and logically sound, making it truly convincing. Even Ms. Sarah, when reading papers, would unconsciously become engrossed in them, occasionally revealing expressions of sudden realization and extreme frustration. If she had seen this paper when she was in school, perhaps she wouldn't just be a cake shop owner now. She looked up at Ethan with a complex expression, and sighed, "The formatting is a bit off, but the data is accurate, so the whole paper seems reasonable and has reference value." Every piece of data inside was clearly marked with its source, so she had no doubt about its authenticity. Ethan was certain. He deliberately wrote it in a clumsy way, otherwise it would have been too outrageous. Miss Sarah moved on to the second paper, a short but profound one, "I Will Try Anything Once: Ethan's Guide to a Magical Life of Happiness." For some reason, Miss Sarah's heart couldn't help but tremble. Chapter 3. On the morning of July 29th, dark clouds hung low in the sky, accompanied by a cool breeze. A spotted cat deftly dodges pedestrians. It hopped into the alley, and soon a woman wearing a bright green cloak and with a serious expression emerged. Minerva McGonagall, the vice-headmistress of Hogwarts, was there to persuade a Muggle family and, incidentally, to verify and evaluate some of the things the gentleman had said in his reply. She reached out and tapped the doorbell at the White's house. Just as Miss Sarah was about to leave, she suddenly paused, staring at the visitor in the emerald green cloak, and tentatively asked, "How can I help you?" Professor McGonagall said somewhat seriously, "I am Minerva McGonagall, the vice-headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry and Professor of Transfiguration. I have come to pay a visit after receiving a reply from Mr. Ethan White." Hogwarts? The magic school? Incredulity and absurdity immediately filled Miss Sarah's eyes. Of course, if it weren't for those 2 papers yesterday, her reaction would have been much stronger, and she might even have called the police. Suppressing her nervousness, she stammered, "Really, it's a great honor to meet you, Professor McGonagall. I'm Sarah White, Ethan's mother. Please come in." Professor McGonagall was also surprised. She had thought she would have to use more persuasion, or even some tricks, since convincing Muggles of the existence of magic, rather than just magic tricks, was not an easy task. She followed Miss Sarah through the courtyard and into the living room, looking around the house while keeping an eye on Miss Sarah as she hurriedly brought out orange juice and cake. The living room has a brown fabric sofa, a coffee table, and a television. There were some white appliances in the kitchen, and the smell of freshly baked omelets still lingered in the air. Teacups and cookie tins were on the coffee table. The room was very small, and there was no indication of the presence of the extension spell. There were almost no empty corners, but it was clear that the owner of the house had always kept it tidy, so it wasn't messy. It seems that Mr. White's family is indeed somewhat strapped for cash. Professor McGonagall nodded almost imperceptibly. "Miss Sarah, you don't seem surprised by my arrival." Miss Sarah hurriedly said, "No, I was utterly shocked. In fact, until last night, I simply couldn't believe that a magic school existed in the world. Professor McGonagall understood and immediately said, "It seems we've met our owl postman." Miss Sarah shook her head. She had only seen Ethan's 2 papers. Last night, Ethan suddenly asked me about magic and wizards, but I didn't know anything about it. However, he probably anticipated this and had written 2 papers beforehand, and I only learned about the magic school at the very end. Professor McGonagall said thoughtfully, "That's quite a remarkable method." A paper about wizards? No, it's a sociological research report, and also his personal views on happiness. He wants to learn magic. Miss Sarah sighed, still feeling that it was somewhat absurd. She actually preferred Ethan to attend Rogers High School, but unfortunately, she lost the negotiation between the 2 last night. She hesitated for a moment, then said softly, "I still want to see magic with my own eyes." Although little Ethan assured me it was all true, he's only 11 years old. Of course, that's one of the reasons I came here. Professor McGonagall took out her wand, pointed it at the teacup on the table, and said, "Transform." The teacup instantly transformed into a large, spotted cat, lazily stretching its back, its pair of bright blue eyes incredibly beautiful. Professor McGonagall then tapped her wand a few times in the air, and the vase turned into a goose, the table into a doe, and the teacup into a flock of birds. Miss Sarah couldn't help but gasp, her eyes widening in surprise, and she was quite flustered. "My God! Is this really not a dream?" Hearing the commotion upstairs, Ethan ran downstairs, and as soon as he entered the living room, he saw a house full of small animals. But when he saw who it was, he was startled. "Professor Minerva McGonagall? Oh my God! Ethan! Look, the cup has turned into a cat. It really is magic." "Yes, Mom, I saw it." The elderly mother was already so shocked that she was incoherent. Professor McGonagall looked at Ethan, her gaze filled with a kind of inquiry that no one else could understand. "Hello, Ethan, Mr. White, I'm Minerva McGonagall, the vice-headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and the professor of Transfiguration." Ethan bowed slightly. "Welcome, Professor McGonagall. I really didn't expect to meet you so soon. This professor's initiative is simply astonishing. And that owl too, it flew back to Hogwarts in one night?" "Mr. White, I have received your letter. Please rest assured, the school will do its best to ensure that every new student can enroll smoothly." Professor McGonagall spoke succinctly, and with a wave of her wand, all the small animals instantly returned to their original forms. Miss Sarah, who had been shouting and yelling, immediately invited Professor McGonagall to sit down, and then couldn't help but glance at the excited Ethan. Indeed, no one can resist the wonder of magic, not even the clever little Ethan. She sighed inwardly and asked somewhat nervously, "I would be delighted for Ethan to attend your school, but is there anything we can do to help?" Professor McGonagall nodded, very seriously, and said, "According to the International Wizarding Secrecy Act, we need parents and schools to sign a secrecy pledge, which has mandatory magical binding force and guarantees that you will not reveal anything about wizards to anyone. In the understanding of most muggles, magic does not exist." Miss Sarah immediately understood, no wonder she knew nothing about these things. After a moment, she asked more nervously, "Professor, I'd like to know, is it necessary to pay 7 years' worth of tuition up front to study at your esteemed institution?" Ethan, who was refilling tea and water nearby, also perked up his ears. Professor McGonagall glanced at Ethan and shook her head slightly. "The school does not charge students tuition or room and board, the Ministry of Magic will cover these costs. In addition, Mr. Ethan White has applied for a grant from the school. If successful, the school will provide him with funds to purchase textbooks and equipment needed for enrollment." "What? A magic school that doesn't charge tuition? Is it a government-run institution?" Miss Sarah was dumbfounded. However, she couldn't hide her joy, saying, "I'm so grateful for the school and the Ministry of Magic's generosity. To be honest, if I weren't so old, I'd really like to learn magic myself, it's truly amazing." "In fact, Madam," Professor McGonagall explained, "only those who have possessed magical abilities are recorded in the Book of Admission and the Pen of Acceptance. Once they turn 11, the school will mail them an acceptance letter." Miss Sarah was momentarily speechless, then smiled sheepishly, well, please understand, after all, no one would be unmoved upon witnessing magic." Chapter 4. The conversation with the school was unusually brief and amicable. Ethan was pleasantly surprised, the stern-faced female professor wasn't as unapproachable as she seemed. Miss Sarah really wanted to invite Professor McGonagall to lunch, but she declined. Professor McGonagall was very busy, and after confirming a few things, she immediately took her leave. The day after their meeting, an owl messenger brought a letter in a small leather bag. The letter informed him that the school had approved his application and that if he did not violate school rules or get expelled within 7 years, the school would provide him with a scholarship every year until he graduated. In addition, a series of addresses were also included. The Leaky Cauldron, Diagon Alley, Ollivander's Wand Shop, Flourish and Blots, King's Cross Station. He opened the bag and poured out some gold coins. Both sides of the coins were engraved with winged western dragon heads and some unreadable letters. "Tomorrow at 1 p.m., I need to arrive at the Leaky Cauldron bar accompanied by a parent. School staff will be waiting there to take me to buy the things I need for school." Ethan thought for a moment, put the coins back into his bag, turned around and ran downstairs. The afternoon of the second day. Charing Cross Road, London. Ethan looked up, staring in astonishment at the large man before him. The man's messy, frizzy hair seemed to be connected to his thick beard, and his large, round eyes were staring at him. "Ethan White. Mr. Hagrid. It's me. Professor McGonagall asked me to take you to Diagon Alley." Hagrid spoke loudly, then quickly glanced at Miss Sarah and a middle-aged, overweight man whose face still retained some handsome features. Ethan introduced, "These are my parents, they came with me today." Mr. Robert and Miss Sarah both nodded slightly in greeting. "If you don't mind, Mr. White and I will be right back." Hagrid held out his hand, pointing to a fast food restaurant nearby, and offered as friendly a smile as possible, "If all goes well, it might only take an hour." "Of course, sir." Robert White ruffled Ethan's hair, took his wife's hand, and headed to the fast food restaurant. Ethan watched them leave, then asked in confusion, "Can't they go?" How could he possibly remember Hermione's parents going into Diagon Alley? "If Professor McGonagall were to come, I suppose I could go," Hagrid explained. "But she's been too busy this year, running around all day. In fact, everyone's been very busy this year. I'm going to look for a student who hasn't received their mail later. So I haven't had time to apply to the Ministry of Magic. You know, not every wizard is friendly to muggles." As Hagrid spoke, he turned and pushed open the broken door of the Leaky Cauldron. Ethan's eyes flickered. "It's really amazing." If Hagrid hadn't turned around and pushed open the door, he wouldn't have noticed that the bar's door was right behind him. Hagrid led him inside. The room was dark and dirty, with a strange, indescribable smell in the air. Some people sat in a corner, talking in hushed tones. Behind the bar, a man with almost no hair picked up a glass and called out from afar, "The usual?" "Hagrid." "No, Tom, I'm in the middle of something." Hagrid picked up Ethan, shook him, and put him back down. "Ethan. Is he this year's budding wizard?" "Very nice, a very handsome young man." Hagrid grinned, led Ethan across the bar, and into a small courtyard, where he leaned against the wall and counted for a long time. "Count 3 pieces up, then 2 pieces horizontally." After counting, he tapped the umbrella end a few times. The bricks on the wall began to shake, and a small hole appeared in the middle. The hole grew larger and larger, and soon a wide archway appeared. Hagrid seemed eager to attend to other matters, leading him inside while quickly saying, "This is Diagon Alley. Follow the shopping list. I have a little suggestion, if your budget is tight, check out the thrift stores first. The stuff there might not be brand new, but who cares? As long as it's cheap. Of course, you still need to buy a new wand, freshmen get a discount." Ethan nodded. Old clothes didn't matter. Like Ron, even his pet was unwanted by his brother, so why would he care? Hagrid was right. Who cared? As long as it was cheap. Diagon Alley was filled with cloaked wizards, and the various shops on both sides were dazzling. Ethan had a lot to buy, but Hagrid only gave him an hour. Along the way, Ethan barely stopped running. He first went to a second-hand shop to buy a robe, hat, and cloak. He had originally wanted to buy a pair of gloves, but they were all worn out, so he had to buy a new pair instead. However, all of this only cost 1.5 galleons in total. Ethan rushed to Flourish and Blotts, and after making a few inquiries, learned that they had second-hand textbooks. Without hesitation, he selected a complete set of textbooks from the list. Unfortunately, these books lack value. Textbooks and wands are the biggest expenses, even second-hand ones still take up a third of the school's allowance. New books cost between 1 and 5 galleons. Ethan walked into Ollivander's wand shop. As soon as he entered the store, a feeling of unease washed over him, followed by a flood of information. Ethan's face flushed, and he forced himself not to look at the wall full of wands. 10 minutes later, he left with a box. Inside the box was a small wand, willow wood, phoenix feathers, 11.5 inches long, with moderate elasticity. Before leaving Diagon Alley, Hagrid handed him a train ticket, saying, "Professor McGonagall asked me to give this to you. You must be on the train before 11 a.m. on September 1st. Don't miss it. Good luck, Mr. White. I have to go now." "Thank you, Mr. Hagrid." Ethan put away his ticket, parted ways with Hagrid at the bar entrance, and pushed his bike alone to the fast food restaurant to look for his parents. Incidentally, he didn't buy an owl. Hagrid said the school had mail delivering owls that would only cost 5 nut for a round trip, which is about 5 pence, or about 43 cents in RMB, 1991. Ethan couldn't possibly write home every day, so after careful consideration, renting an owl from the school was much more cost-effective than buying one. The Whites looked at the clothes and books in the trolley with great curiosity. Miss Sarah noticed that the clothes seemed old, and the corners of the textbooks were badly worn, with some even almost falling apart. She pursed her lips and said softly, "Actually, we have savings at home. Even in a wizarding society, we should need pounds, right?" Ethan replied without hesitation, "Mom, what I need is the knowledge inside the book, not its outward appearance. Hogwarts is a 7-year program, but textbooks are changed every year. Unless the school makes a special requirement, there is no need to buy brand new ones." In his previous life, when he was in college, he bought all second-hand textbooks online. Besides, although the school waives tuition and room and board fees, it doesn't mean you don't have to spend a single penny. For example, there are expenses for stationery, so you should save where you can and plan ahead. Miss Sarah didn't say anything else, she just gently pinched Ethan's cheek. Chapter 5. With a month to go before the start of the semester, Ethan immediately made a timetable for himself upon returning home, which included several important required courses at Hogwarts. Transfiguration is both complex and dangerous, and not suitable for self-study. A teacher must be present to supervise and correct mistakes constantly. It's best not to try to learn it on your own to prevent misunderstandings. Ethan set aside the beginner's guide to Transfiguration for every morning, placing it alongside some foreign language textbooks. He planned to memorize the entire book word for word, but wouldn't delve into it before the start of the school year. The thousands of miraculous herbs and mushrooms isn't dangerous, it's purely memorization. I can spend 2 hours a day memorizing it. Fantastic Beasts and A History of Magic are good bedtime reading. Potions and spells require a lot of memorization and comprehension. Ethan quickly categorized the courses, scheduling the less important ones during his relaxation time, while the important core subjects, such as potions, charms, and herbalism, occupied the prime time slots each day. He patted his cheeks, opened the book A Thousand Miraculous Herbs and Mushrooms, took a deep breath, and began to read aloud. Dictamnus daisy carpus is a potent healing and restorative herb. It can be consumed raw to heal superficial wounds, and its efficacy is even more pronounced when extracted into an essential oil. The hyena tree is a magical tree, also known as the hyena tree. Its leaves can trigger hysteria and uncontrollable laughter. Aconite is sometimes also called boat-shaped aconite or wolfsbane aconite. It's called wolfsbane aconite because exchange experience +3. Time flies, and a month has passed in a fulfilling way. During this month, he gained a total of 3 free potential points which he immediately allocated to magic. Ethan White Magic, 5. September 1st. Outside King's Cross Station. Ethan hugged his elderly father and mother, waved goodbye, and with some reluctance, dragged a large suitcase into the station alone, quickly finding platforms 9 and 10. He stared at it for a while, but didn't rush to bang his head against the wall. A wall has 2 sides, what if he hits the wrong one? Before long, a father and daughter arrived nearby, chattering away. The man wore a bright yellow robe that almost dragged on the ground. Beneath the robe, a section of equally bold scarlet lantern trousers was visible. His long, pure white hair, as fluffy as cotton candy, was not tied up, it was thick and voluminous, cascading down his head like a cloud. The girl next to him was petite, with long, smooth golden hair draped over her shoulders, its color as pale as moonlight, and her light-colored eyes appearing ethereal. "Remember what I told you about those harassing flies? They especially like to swarm around anxious newborns, buzzing and creating chaos. I'll wear my glasses, Dad. They'll keep those really big, purple-spotted horseflies away." The two of them, talking as they pushed the cart, crashed through the wall. Ethan watched this scene thoughtfully. It seemed to be Luna and her unreliable old father. Having seen someone set an example, Ethan no longer hesitated. He gripped the suitcase handle, ran, and dashed into the wall. His vision suddenly dimmed, and when he came to his senses, he saw a deep red steam train with a sign that read, "The Hogwarts Express." The platform was almost packed with people. Thick smoke from the steam train blanketed the sky. Cats of various colors darted back and forth among the crowd. He could faintly hear the sound of train wheels behind him. Ethan didn't have time to look closely. He quickly made way, weaving through the chattering crowd, and squeezed onto the train first. He settled his luggage in the back of the carriage, took a seat, and only then had time to look out the window. He saw Luna and her father who had come in earlier. The two were still talking on the platform when Luna's father took out a shiny, radish-shaped earring from his pocket. On the other side was a chubby, dazed-looking round-faced boy, who was holding the hand of an old woman in a tall hat, saying something with a dejected expression. Ethan felt inexplicably dazed. In his past life, he was sitting in front of a computer watching this scene, but in this life, he was sitting on a train, looking through a small window at this scene that was both real and dreamlike. He rubbed his temples, stopped paying attention to what was happening outside, pulled out his thick textbook, and buried himself in reading. He didn't know how much time had passed when a long, drawn-out whistle startled him awake. Ethan looked up blankly and realized that he was no longer on the platform, but in a range of undulating mountains. Exchange experience, +1. "Are you looking at a herbalism textbook?" A girl's voice, slightly higher in pitch but with clear pronunciation, entered my ears. Ethan looked up in surprise and found 2 other people his age in his carriage. Beside me was that absent-minded, round-faced boy, and across from me sat a girl with messy brown hair and a pair of large front teeth. She tilted her little face up. It was she who had asked the question earlier. Ethan blinked, waved the textbook, and nodded, saying, "It's a good book." The girl raised an eyebrow, a smile playing on her lips, and spoke quickly, "I also read herbalism during the holidays, and I memorized it all. In fact, I've memorized all the textbooks. But I prefer Potions Mastery and Transfiguration. Those two courses are extremely difficult. I heard that even the school professors can't guarantee we'll learn them 100%. Have you looked at those two courses?" This little girl is quite young, but she speaks with an air of maturity beyond her years, like a proud little peacock. Ethan vaguely guessed her identity and said calmly, "I disagree with you. As you said, these two courses are very difficult. Without the professor's guidance, trying them on your own would be dangerous and could easily lead to bad habits. Therefore, I haven't studied either of them in detail." "Oh, really? Maybe you're a little timid." She raised her chin, a smug look on her face. "I've tried a few simple spells at home, and they all worked. And I didn't encounter any danger. Although no one in my family knows magic, I believe that appropriate experimentation is permissible as long as one is cautious enough." "Yes, that's really impressive." Ethan smiled and continued reading. "Read a book 100 times, and its meaning will become clear." Although he had memorized it all, every time he reread it, he could always find some parts that he had inadvertently overlooked. The girl, about to introduce herself, saw him start reading again and puffed out her cheeks. Turning to another boy, she said confidently, "My name is Hermione Granger. What's yours?" The little boy seemed very shy, and timidly said, "Navy Longbottom. A pleasure to meet you. And may this gentleman who enjoys reading be of the honorable name." Ethan realized he wouldn't be able to read in peace any longer, so he closed his book and said, "My name is Ethan White, nice to meet you, Miss Granger, Mr. Longbottom." Hermione asked, "That's a very common surname. Are you a wizarding family?" White shook his head, while Neville nodded. Hermione glanced at Ethan in surprise, then said with a hint of delight, "I'm not from a wizarding family either, both my parents are dentists." Neville, head bowed, said dejectedly, "They used to be Aurors, now they're in the hospital." Ethan glanced at him, then at the somewhat bewildered Hermione, and said, "My family runs a very small cake shop, if you don't mind." He took out 3 small paper boxes, each about the size of a bowl, containing a dollop of cream and strawberries. "This is a strawberry Swiss roll, made by my mom." Hermione and Neville's eyes widened considerably as they each took a portion and held it very carefully. Hermione exclaimed, "No wonder I kept smelling that sweet creamy aroma. The texture is sweet and creamy, and the cake roll is so fluffy." Neville, standing to the side, just kept his head down and ate, his mouth covered in cream. White suddenly noticed something jump out of the carriage. He thought for a moment and then reminded him, "Mr. Longbottom, it looks like your pet has run away." Neville stared at him blankly, then looked down and searched again, before letting out a scream, "Reverie!" He hurriedly ran out of the train carriage with the cake roll in his hand. Hermione quickly finished the cake in the box and ran out shouting, "It was delicious. I'll treat you to something when we get to school, but right now, I need to go find Longbottom's pet. Oh, and you'd better change into your robes, we're almost at school." Ethan then noticed that the little witch was wearing a brand new, plain robe. Chapter 6. My goodness, you'd never guess who I just ran into. Hermione and Neville returned just before getting out of the car. Judging from Neville's expression, they clearly hadn't found their pet. Hermione looked at Ethan, unable to hide her excitement, and said, "I met Harry Potter. The savior who killed Manhunt. He was sitting in the next carriage. With a boy named Weasley." "Really? That's wonderful." Hermione, dissatisfied with Ethan's reaction, asked curiously, "Don't you know Harry Potter? This is a major event lately. Without him, the world would be in who knows what chaos it would be in." Ethan nodded helplessly, "Now I know, he's really amazing." He certainly knew Harry Potter, but logically speaking, he shouldn't know too much, since he wasn't from a wizarding family and hadn't bought any extracurricular books. Distracted, Neville timidly replied, "Granger, White isn't from a wizarding family." Hermione shook her head, "I'm not from a wizarding family either, but it's common knowledge, at least in the wizarding world. Harry Potter's name is mentioned in books like A History of Modern Magic, The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts, and important magical events of the 20th century." Ethan didn't answer, but turned to look out the window. The sky still held a lingering deep purple hue, and the mountains and forests stretched endlessly. The train gradually slowed down. "The train will arrive at Hogwarts in 5 minutes. Please leave your luggage on the train, and we will take it to the school for you." This message echoed throughout the train. Ethan stood up, checked the suitcase, especially his own name, and only after confirming that everything was correct did he step into the carriage, with Hermione and Neville following closely behind. When the train came to a complete stop, the young wizards rushed to the doors and disembarked onto a small, dark platform. The chill of the night made one shiver. "First-year students! First-year students, come this way!" A loud, gruff voice drowned out all the noise, and the crowd spontaneously surged toward it. "Come on! This way, get on the boat! Hurry up, follow me!" The person in charge of welcoming the new students was none other than Hagrid, whose imposing figure was exceptionally conspicuous. At this moment, he was holding a lamp and greeting everyone, while also making sure to greet a thin little boy wearing glasses. Hermione gently nudged Ethan's back and whispered, "Look, that's Harry Potter." Ethan stared for a moment, then nodded. Everyone followed Hagrid down a steep, narrow path that led to a black lake. A majestic castle stands on the opposite shore of the lake, its spires towering high, and its windows shimmering under the starry sky. Ethan was slightly stunned. Hogwarts was so vividly presented before his eyes. "No more than 4 people on each boat," Hagrid shouted, pointing to a fleet of small boats moored on the shore. Harry and a red-haired boy, who were closest to each other, boarded the small boat. Hermione and Neville followed closely behind, and Hermione didn't forget to glance back at him as she boarded. Ethan had no intention of joining the crowd. He casually picked a small boat, quietly walked aboard, sat down, and looked up, gazing at the castle. "It's spectacular, isn't it?" A slightly ethereal voice rang in my ears. Ethan tilted his head slightly and met the gaze of a pair of light-colored eyes. The owner of the eyes had a very delicate and beautiful face and wore a pair of small carrot-shaped earrings. He nodded, "That's great." Luna stared at him blankly, tilting her head, and said, "We've met before, at the train station, twice. That's quite a coincidence. My name is Ethan White." Ethan extended his hand. "Luna Lovegood." Little Luna also extended her hand, gave him a light handshake, and said, "My father's name is Synovalius Lovegood. You've met him, he's the editor-in-chief of the Quibbler. Nice to meet you." Ethan suddenly noticed that someone was watching them. He glanced back instinctively and saw Neville on the other boat staring blankly at him. The small boat glided across the mirror-like surface of the lake until it reached a hidden, open entrance. He followed the crowd along a dark tunnel, down a flight of stone steps, and arrived at a huge oak door. A tall, black-haired witch in a bright green robe stood waiting at the gate. Her expression was serious, and her gaze was very imposing. Under her gaze, the noisy little wizards quickly fell silent. Ethan, standing in the crowd, noticed Professor McGonagall glancing in their direction. He gave a slight bow to express his gratitude for the train ticket. Professor McGonagall withdrew her gaze and said seriously, "Welcome to Hogwarts. Before the opening banquet, we need to assign you to 4 houses, Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. During your time at Hogwarts, your house is your home. Your excellent performance will earn you points, and any misconduct will deduct points. Ethan listened attentively. Now, everyone line up in a single file. Everyone obediently did as instructed, and then followed Professor McGonagall into the hall in single file. Ethan's eyes lit up as he spotted countless candles floating in mid-air, their twinkling lights illuminating the hall. Hogwarts, he was momentarily lost in thought. Hannah Abbott. Susan Bournes. Tarabed. Justin Finley. Professor McGonagall spoke throughout, and applause continued to ring out. Ethan White. Ethan suddenly heard his name called and instinctively looked ahead. Some young wizards were looking left and right, while Professor McGonagall was watching him from afar. My turn. Ethan squeezed through the crowd toward the dirty, patched old hat. Supposedly it had been there since the school was founded, almost 1,000 years ago, and who knew if it had ever been washed. All eyes were on this. Ethan sat on the stool, his hat pulled down over his head for a moment, when a faint, unfamiliar voice entered his heart. I can sense the immense courage hidden within you. You once subdued a hunting dog much larger than yourself, protecting a little girl from being bitten, didn't you? Your little brain also tells me that you are very hard-working, always treating tedious studying as the only thing in your life. Incredible courage, unwavering will. You're practically a born Gryffindor. Of course, Ravenclaw would also suit you. I might need to think about it some more. It's going to be another difficult decision. Ethan asked in a low voice, what about Hufflepuff? Is Hufflepuff not right for me? Hufflepuff? No, Hufflepuff prefers honest and upright little wizards. What do you mean? Are you saying I'm dishonest? My inner voice tells me that you are mostly honest, but occasionally you tell a few small lies to deal with things you don't want to do. Ethan frowned. Those are irrelevant, and I don't consider it lying. It's just a flexible approach, it won't hurt anyone, so I'm very honest. The Sorting Hat immediately let out a hoarse, mocking laugh. Time passed slowly, and everyone remained silent, staring in astonishment at Ethan beneath the Sorting Hat. Isn't this taking a little too long? After a long while, the Sorting Hat finally made its decision and shouted, Gryffindor. At that moment, the applause from the Gryffindor table was exceptionally enthusiastic. Chapter 7. Ethan sat down at the Gryffindor table. Opposite him was Hermione Granger, diagonally opposite was the green-eyed boy with round glasses, and on his other side was Neville Longbottom. Beside him was Mr. Weasley, with his red hair. Hermione pointed at him, very excitedly saying, his name is Ethan White. His mother makes delicious cream rolls. Hermione seemed to have become the introducer, pointing excitedly to the side, that's Harry Potter. Ethan glanced at him, he was indeed very thin and small. Then came Ron Weasley, George Weasley, Fred Weasley, and our prefect, Percy Weasley. They are the 4 Weasley brothers. A litter of Weasleys. Ethan stood up and shook hands with each of them. Harry looked at him curiously, his eyes filled with inquiry, but he wasn't at all awkward. In fact, ever since leaving Gringotts, he had suddenly realized that he no longer needed to rely on others, and the timidity in his heart had lessened considerably. After the Tattered Hat had assigned a house to the last young wizard, the headmaster, whose beard almost touched the ground, stood up, opened his arms, and shouted, "The banquet begins." No sooner had he finished speaking than a large amount of food appeared on the table: salt-baked chicken legs, boiled corn, roast beef, roast chicken, pork chops, lamb chops, sausages, steak. Cheers immediately filled the hall. With the delicious food in his mouth, Ethan's gloomy and damp mood finally improved a bit. Hermione cleared her throat slightly and held out her small hand, "Ethan White." Ethan looked at her, then at his own greasy hands, and said with a hint of confusion, "We already know each other, Miss Granger." Hermione tossed her hair, clearly annoyed. "But you shook hands with everyone you know, you can't skip me and Longbottom." Neville, who was engrossed in his meal, looked up blankly and whispered, "It's all right, Granger." Ethan wiped his hands clean, gave her a brief handshake, and then extended his hand to Neville. Neville eagerly grasped his hand, revealing a big smile. "That completes the process." Ethan reached for the chicken leg, but suddenly, a transparent grayish-white substance appeared in his hand, followed by a message that popped into his mind. "You have touched a ghost. Unlock rare attribute, Spirit. Initial value, 3. Unlock attribute, Mental Resistance. Initial value, 2. Sir Nicholas Demoncy Porpington exchange value, 3. Mental Strength, Mental Resistance. Redeem." Ethan didn't know what was going on, but that didn't stop him from shouting it out in his mind. Mental Strength +1. Mental Resistance +2. A faint sound of panic came from under the table. The illusory figure under his hand swayed slightly and disappeared with a whoosh. Ethan, with a calm expression, grabbed a large chicken leg. Elsewhere, low murmurs arose as countless ghosts danced and roamed the air, greeting the newly arrived young wizards. "Oh my god! A ghost! White, look up!" Hermione was also yelling and shouting. Ethan took a sip of his juice, swallowing the tempting saliva. He squinted at the ghosts running around, feeling a ticklish sensation in his heart, as if a feather were gently scratching at it. If I could touch them all one by one, task, that would be so tempting. The ghosts of Hogwarts came and went quickly, seemingly only to make a brief appearance before the new students. Sir Nicholas, whom Ethan had touched, reappeared, scrutinizing each table of new students with great suspicion, trying to find the culprit who had attacked him earlier. Ethan noticed that he was more transparent than the other ghosts. When everyone had eaten and drunk their fill, all the remaining food disappeared from their plates. After a while, pudding and various flavors of ice cream, apple pie, fruit pie, strawberry, jelly, appeared on the table. They looked so sweet. Ethan only took some strawberries, eating them while listening to the young wizards around him introduce themselves. Neville was raised by his grandmother, Simo, who is of mixed race. Hermione wanted to talk to Ethan about Transfiguration, but seeing that Ethan was focused on dealing with Strawberry, she ended up talking to Percy instead. The evening was quite lively, making Ethan, who was used to studying alone, feel somewhat uncomfortable. "Percy, which professor is speaking with Professor Quirrell?" "That's Professor Snape, the potions master, and the head of Slytherin." Listening to Harry and Percy's conversation, Ethan also turned around and glanced back. Snape, with a gloomy expression, was talking to Professor Quirrell, who had a scarf wrapped around his head and looked timid and submissive. After a long time, the dessert also disappeared. Headmaster Dumbledore stood up, and all the wizards' eyes immediately turned to him. He emphasized the school rules, such as prohibiting students from entering the Forbidden Forest, not allowing them to wander in the corridors at night, not allowing them to cast spells in the corridors during breaks, and not allowing them to enter the right-hand corridor on the 4th floor. Ethan listened calmly, but a dark glint flickered deep in his eyes. "Now, before going to bed, let's sing the school song together." Ethan looked up in confusion, only to see lines of twisting text appearing above the dining table. Then, all the teachers and students sang a song at the direction of the conductor. But because they hadn't learned anything, everyone's tune and rhythm were out of sync, so it was like a bomb, making a loud, buzzing noise, and you couldn't hear anything at all. Ethan covered his ears in great pain. Hermione, Harry, Ron, and the others all had the same expression as him, but it seemed that only Dumbledore looked like he was enjoying himself. After the singing, each college, led by its 5th-year head, returned to their respective dormitories in an orderly manner. 5 people share a room in the dormitory. In this life, Ethan was both lucky and unlucky to replace Dean and become roommates with Harry, Ron, Neville, and Seamus. Lying in bed, Ethan opened his eyes, his gaze distant and unfocused. Now that things have come to this, the only thing we can do is try every possible way to increase our strength, so as to avoid being eliminated halfway through. Just like the defense against the dark arts says, the best defense against the dark arts is to kill the enemy before they kill me. But that tattered hat of his, how dare he accuse him of dishonesty? We'll settle the score with him sooner or later. The next morning, just after 6 o'clock, Ethan woke up from his sleep on time. The sky was still a tranquil dark blue. Ethan took his Transfiguration textbook and his wand and tiptoed out of the dormitory. The fat lady, whose portrait blocked the door, muttered a few words to Ethan. Ethan glanced at her, then reached out and touched her. Portrait of the fat lady, exchange value 1, mental resistance. Ethan withdrew his hand, gave her a deep look, and walked towards the Transfiguration classroom on the first floor of the school, under the fat lady's bewildered stare. The Transfiguration classroom was empty. Unsurprisingly, Ethan lit a candle, opened his textbook, and began reading intently. As dawn broke, a tabby cat nimbly leaped into the classroom, bounced a few times on the desks, and landed silently on Ethan's desk. Ethan didn't pay attention to it, keeping turning the first Transfiguration over and over, his eyebrows furrowed the whole time. Previously, due to safety concerns, he forced himself not to delve into Transfiguration, but simply read and memorized the textbook content. This is a stupid method of rote memorization, which he forcibly learned from cramming education in his previous life. Transfiguration must first comply with Gump's laws, namely the 5 exceptions. It is impossible to conjure food out of thin air, it is impossible to create intelligent life out of thin air or to give souls to inanimate objects. How to turn a matchstick into a needle. Ethan was lost in thought as he unconsciously gestured with his wand. The spotted cat on the table nimbly jumped away. Suddenly a gentle voice sounded from behind. "Good morning, Mr. White. You're up very early." Ethan snapped out of his reverie, quickly sat up, turned to Professor McGonagall, and said, "Good morning, Professor. The thought of the first class being such a magical transfiguration lesson is making me unable to stay in bed any longer." Professor McGonagall looked at Ethan with surprise, a slight smile appearing on her face, and then asked, "Mr. White, what are your thoughts on Transfiguration?" Chapter 8. What are your thoughts on Transfiguration? Ethan thought for a moment, then said carefully, "It's very magical and very rigorous. I believe it's the most representative form of witchcraft." Professor McGonagall did not answer. Instead, she said in a serious tone, "As you said, Transfiguration is the most complex, rigorous, and dangerous art. It allows no room for error. Even the slightest mistake in the movement of the wand could lead to very serious consequences. But equally, it is incredibly captivating, capable of bringing about all sorts of incredible changes." Professor McGonagall glanced at the sky and said, "Don't forget to have breakfast in the hall, you can't concentrate on your studies on an empty stomach." "I'll keep track of the time, Professor." Professor McGonagall is gone. An hour later, Ethan put down his book and went to the auditorium for breakfast. Young wizards came and went in the hall one after another, their faces showing signs of drowsiness. Last night was the opening banquet for the new semester, and since we all had new roommates, we naturally chatted until very late. As Ethan was working on his fruit pie, a blonde girl sat down opposite him with a plate. Her light-colored eyes were fixed on him as she spoke softly. "Good morning, White." Ethan swallowed the food in his mouth, nodded, and said, "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" "Not bad. My dad folded a little triangular flag for me from the cover of the Quibbler, and I stuck it on my bedside table. I wasn't bothered by the curved-horned snoring beast all night." Ethan was speechless. "Actually," Luna blinked, looking at him with great curiosity, "I'm curious about something. You don't have any harassing flies around you?" "Everyone I've met has harassing flies around them. My dad even said they especially like to huddle around anxious freshmen." Ethan thought for a moment, then said uncertainly, maybe it's because I don't have anything to worry about. Luna pondered for a moment, somewhat puzzled. If it were yesterday, it would probably be like this, but today there are many more. Is something bothering them? Ethan looked at her in surprise and mumbled, life is full of disappointments. It's such a waste that this girl isn't studying divination. This was all thanks to that tattered hat, but this couldn't be said. If word got out that he disliked Gryffindor, it would incur the hostility of the other Gryffindors. Life is rarely perfect, that's so true. Luna was slightly surprised, then extended her hand cheerfully, Ethan, you can call me Luna. That's a real honor. Ethan shook her hand briefly again. Since Ravenclaw's first lesson wasn't Transfiguration, Luna only ate some fruit and egg tarts before saying goodbye and leaving. As Ethan finished his milk and was about to leave, Hermione arrived, yawning. She plopped down in Luna's seat, placed her Transfiguration textbook aside, and, while spreading jam on her bread, asked, "Are you and that Ravenclaw girl friends?" Ethan sat down again, ordered another cup of tea, and said meaningfully, "I think friends and time aren't the same thing. Over the years, I believe Miss Granger hasn't become friends with every classmate she's interacted with." Hermione was speechless, and could only say, "I heard you calling each other's names. If Miss Granger is willing, we can also address each other by our first names." Hermione paused, her cheeks flushing slightly. She shook her head firmly, "My father said that you can't tell if someone is good or bad in a short time. Only time can tell us the true answer. Therefore, I believe that for two people to become friends, they need to spend at least 6 months together." After saying that, she added, "Of course, people like Malfoy are an exception. They're far too arrogant and rude. I won't wait 6 months. I'll never let him call me by my name again." Actually, Malfoy and his 2 companions had a minor altercation with Harry on the train yesterday, and they almost got into another argument with him in front of Professor McGonagall yesterday. Hermione really dislikes them. Ethan remained non-committal. This little witch eats rather slowly and talks rather a lot, but thankfully she's well-mannered and doesn't talk while eating. After she finally finished eating, Ethan and she rushed to the Transfiguration classroom, with only 10 minutes left before class started. Hermione searched the classroom, but the professor hadn't arrived yet. There was only a tabby cat, whose owner was unknown, perched on the professor's desk. "White, haven't we seen Potter and Weasley?" Ethan thought for a moment, nodded, and stopped talking. He found an empty seat, opened the book, and continued reading about Transfiguration. Experience points exchanged, +3. Random experience exchange, 302/100. Free exchange experience, 302/300. Ethan stroked his chin, pondering where he should best channel this potential for freedom. Intelligence and spirit are both rare attributes, not easily obtained randomly. If 5 points of magic power are enough, I'd prefer to use 1 point of free attribute and choose between these two. A moment later, he allocated the attribute points to intelligence. Intelligence +1, 8. The magic course is very profound, intellectual skills should be of greater help to him than spiritual ones. Besides, there are so many ghosts in the school. Once he learns the disillusionment charm, he can get lucky. Last night, he managed to get a little bit of spirit from Sir Nicholas. Ethan felt his brain become more active again, and when he looked at the textbook again, he quickly gained some new understanding and insights. Time passed little by little. The 10 minutes before class seemed to last an exceptionally long time. The professor was late, and neither were Harry and Ron. Hermione kept glancing back at the door, her eyes filled with confusion. This lesson was for Gryffindors and Slytherins together. The Malfoy trio sat at the front desk, being stared down at by the spotted cat. Malfoy couldn't find Harry, nor did he intend to cause trouble. He sat obediently on the stool, not exactly obedient, of course, because Professor McGonagall had warned everyone yesterday. Anyone who misbehaves in my class will be asked to leave and never be allowed to come back. Transfiguration is notoriously difficult. This serious female professor always kept her word, and even Malfoy wouldn't dare to go against her. In the quiet classroom, the two young wizards finally arrived in a hurry. Hermione glanced back and saw Harry and Ron, both covered in sweat. Ron breathed a sigh of relief. We made it. Thank goodness the professor hasn't arrived yet. If she knew we were late. Before he could finish speaking, the tabby cat on the table suddenly leaped down and transformed into Professor McGonagall's appearance. The two were dumbfounded. Ethan was also stunned, and then a word popped into his mind, animagus. That's amazing! Ron exclaimed, stunned. Thank you for the compliment. Professor McGonagall said, quite annoyed. But perhaps I should turn you two into pocket watches, maybe then you'll understand the importance of being punctual. Harry was startled and said nervously, I'm so sorry, we're lost and Mr. Filch stopped us. Filch thought they were going to the 4th floor and blocked their way, threatening to lock them in the dungeon. If Professor Quirrell hadn't happened to pass by, they might not have even made it to their Transfiguration class. Then should I turn you all into a map? I believe finding your seat shouldn't require a map, right? The two of them shrank back and sat down without saying a word. Everyone has finally arrived. Professor McGonagall looked around, convinced that if she weren't the head of Gryffindor, she would have lost a lot of points earlier. Mr. Ethan White. Ethan, who was pondering the incantation, subconsciously stood up. Professor McGonagall gestured for him to sit down, glanced to the side, and said, if you may, I'd like to ask you to remind Mr. Weasley and Mr. Potter to get up when you do, so they should have ample time to find the classroom. Harry and Ron both looked at Ethan. They knew Ethan was their roommate, but they hadn't talked much last night, they were still relatively strangers. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then tentatively asked, according to my schedule. Professor McGonagall nodded very seriously. I can try it tomorrow. Chapter 9. Before learning how to turn a match into a needle, I want to see how many people are still unclear about GAMP's basic transmutation laws and the most fundamental principles of transmutation. Ron and Harry honestly raised their hands. However, they weren't the only two who didn't know. Roughly a third of the students from both colleges raised their hands. Professor McGonagall's brow twitched a few times, and she had no choice but to start from the first page of the textbook. Transfiguration is a very detailed and rigorous subject, so even for just the Silver Needle Transfiguration, theoretical knowledge took up 3/4 of the time. By the time Professor McGonagall finally finished, there was only half an hour left before the end of Get Out of Class. Then, without much hope, she handed out a match to everyone. Ethan put down his quill. Even though he had previewed the textbook and could recite it word for word, he still took thick notes. Professor McGonagall shared many things that weren't in the textbooks, and some of her insights were invaluable, helping him avoid many pitfalls. Although Ethan tried his best to keep up with and understand Professor McGonagall's line of thought, and to dissect the problem from that perspective. Even with an intelligence score of 8, it still seemed quite challenging, and the method itself wasn't necessarily very accurate. After all these years, Professor McGonagall's ideas must have been constantly summarized and optimized based on a solid foundation of transformation theory. But if you're going to learn, you should naturally learn the best. Experience points exchanged, +11. After receiving the matches, Ethan pointed his wand at them, the scenes Professor McGonagall had emphasized flashing through his mind. He suddenly swung it and whispered, "Transform." The matchstick quickly stretched and thinned, gleaming with a silvery sheen, and a slender silver needle soon appeared on the table. Ethan could clearly feel the magic draining away. He gazed at the silver needles, a surge of excitement and joy welling up within him. A moment later, he waved his wand again, and the silver needles turned back into matchsticks. After repeating this 3 times, Ethan finally calmed down and was no longer as nervous as he had been at the beginning. This lesson will not only involve practicing transformation spells, but also restoration spells. Ethan glanced around and noticed that the young wizards were all engrossed in staring at the matches, and no one was paying attention to him sitting in the corner. This made him slightly relieved. He picked up his pen and wrote down his feelings and shortcomings about using the Transfiguration spell in his notebook. The magic power is still a bit low. 5 points of magic power can only support about 20 transformations. However, if the object to be transformed is slightly larger, it may not be usable. For example, Professor McGonagall casually turned a desk into a pig. Even if he could perfectly replicate the entire process, he definitely couldn't do it. To increase magic power, we also need to boost our morale. Ethan turned the match into a needle and began to silently keep track of time. This time he wanted to see how long the Transfiguration spell could last. Professor McGonagall appeared before his desk at some point, clapping softly. "Your transformation and restoration spells are excellent, Mr. White. It seems you've mastered them." Ethan was startled, completely unaware that a professor had appeared next to him. "You flatter me, Professor." Professor McGonagall looked around and said, "Since Mr. White not only succeeded in transforming first, but also skillfully used the Transfiguration and Restore charms, Gryffindor gets 2 points." After she finished speaking, she returned to the podium. The young wizards around them, still struggling with their textbooks, stared in astonishment. Whether they were Gryffindors, Slytherins, or even Hermione, she looked utterly incredulous. Malfoy, at the very front, also had a deep frown on his face, seemingly trying to figure out who this guy was. Harry and Ron, standing nearby, quietly gave him a thumbs up. "You're awesome, White." Ethan smiled shyly and continued to ponder the mysteries of Transfiguration. The class finally ended, and before the bell rang, Hermione, along with him, successfully conjured silver needles. The little witch looked very happy when Professor McGonagall praised her. As soon as Professor McGonagall left after class, Ethan quickly pulled Harry and Ron to a corner of the corridor, looking at them with a very serious expression. "I sincerely suggest you apologize to Professor McGonagall and promise her you'll never be late again. That might change her mind about having me wake you up." Ron and Harry, who had been watching him nervously, were both bewildered upon hearing his words and asked, "You don't want to, White?" "It's not that I don't want to, it's just that I get up too early. It's a habit I've had for many years. If I suddenly made you all get up at the same time as me, you'd be listless all day." Harry said confidently, "It's okay. What time do you get up?" "When I lived with Uncle Vernon, I had to get up at 7:30 every morning." "That's right," Ron said, somewhat angrily. That family abused Harry. 6 o'clock in the morning. What? 6 in the morning? Good heavens! Harry and Ron stumbled back a few steps, staring at him in disbelief. Coming to their senses, they looked at Ethan with pitiful eyes, as if he were a pony that had been abused for a long time. Harry said cautiously, "White, if you're mistreated at home too, I can invite you to stay at my Uncle Vernon's house during the summer holidays. I'll sleep in a cubicle under the stairs, but at least I won't have to get up at 6. Ron nodded in agreement. "White, Harry, maybe we should go find the professors and tell them about this." Getting up at 6 in the morning, he's even more pathetic than Harry. Harry Potter did not deny this, and his gaze toward Ethan was full of understanding and sympathy. The way they handled it so carefully was as if they were holding a piece of glass riddled with shards. Ethan pursed his lips. "Two damn bastards!" he said helplessly. "You've misunderstood. My family treats me very well. I haven't been abused. This is a habit I developed myself. Besides waking up early, I also like to go to bed early. I don't like staying up late, and I don't like noisy parties late at night." After saying that, he shook his head and warned, "No, we've gone off topic. You two, if you don't want to get up at 6 every morning, go apologize to Professor McGonagall right now and get her forgiveness." This time, the two of them didn't hesitate and ran as fast as they could towards Professor McGonagall's office. Harry was even more determined. "If you get up earlier at school than at Uncle Vernon's house, wouldn't that make Uncle Vernon's house seem nicer?" "No. Does White have masochistic tendencies?" Ethan watched them leave, then headed to the library with his books. Although get out of class was over, Professor McGonagall assigned a lot of homework, including a paper that needed to be submitted before Thursday's Transfiguration class. Of course, before that, he needed to find out where the ghosts of Hogwarts usually slept. He really needs them. Chapter 10. On the second floor of the vast library, Ethan put down his homework, picked up the borrowed book A Study of the Development of Modern Witchcraft, and began to carefully peruse it. The disillusionment spell is a spell that can only be learned in 6th grade. And to learn it, you have to pass the OWL exam first. Ethan sighed softly. No wonder everyone loves the forbidden book section. However, the disillusionment spell is such a high-level spell. Putting aside the difficulty of learning it, even with his current magic power, he probably wouldn't be able to learn it even if he came across it. I need to quickly improve my 3 rare attributes: magic power, intelligence, and spirit. If I can raise them all to 10, I might be able to meet the basic requirements for learning the illusionary body charm. Ethan suddenly shook his head again. Why go to such lengths to learn the illusionary body spell, if not to quickly improve your attributes? Looks like I'll have to find another way, look for things that are valuable. I'll stay away from those ghosts for now. If they complain, I'll be in big trouble. It seems that Headmaster Dumbledore is skilled in a kind of memory-reading magic, before which all lies are exposed. Ethan quickly flipped through the books, and his gaze involuntarily tightened when he saw a line of text. The solution to mind control is occupational surgery. Ethan couldn't help but rub his head. We must not overlook a single flower, blade of grass, or tree at Hogwarts. A thorough search of everything of value is essential, finding even the slightest bit of rarity is a bonus. We also need to accumulate free exchange experience as soon as possible to exchange for rare attributes. Suppressing his frustration, Ethan took out a thick magic book and buried himself in it. Exchange experience, +5. As the midday bell rang, Ethan and the librarian, Mrs. Pants, borrowed the magic book and left the library alone. Just as he reached the bottom of the stairs, he suddenly heard a little witch shouting angrily. He looked over in surprise and saw a bristling Hermione jumping up and down, throwing a punch. Peeves, the little gnome floating in midair, is laughing as he flicks ink and chalk at Hermione's head. The little witch was clearly in trouble, her hair, cheeks, and clothes were covered in ink stains. Hermione angrily drew her wand, but Peeves dodged it with incredible agility. However, Hermione didn't know any powerful spells, and most spells were ineffective against Peeves. Hermione's eyes quickly welled up with tears. Ethan stared intently at it and shouted, "The Bloodman Barrow is here!" The mischievous ghost, who was having a great time, was startled and quickly scurried into the wall. Ethan strode over and, before it disappeared, slammed his hand on the wall. Spooky Ghost, Spirit, Exchange Value, 3, Agility, Spell Resistance, Spirit Resistance. Redeem. Agility +1. Spell Resistance +1. Mental Resistance +1. Ethan immediately ran to Hermione's side and pulled her into the classroom next door. Hermione, looking at the ink stains on her body, could no longer hold back and began to sob. Ethan hesitated, then stopped himself. This Pippi was a special creature at the school, it wasn't a ghost or a person, and even the professors couldn't handle it. It was a truly infuriating thing. He took 2 steps back, drew his wand, pointed it at Hermione, and after a moment, whispered, "Cleanse." The little witch's stains vanished instantly. She stared wide-eyed at her clothes in disbelief, then quickly touched her hair and cheeks. Ethan breathed a slight sigh of relief. I was actually a little nervous using the cleansing spell for the first time. Hermione wiped her eyes, looked at Ethan strangely, and pouted, saying, "You've even learned the cleansing charm." Not quite there yet," Ethan mumbled, then whispered, "If we run into Peeves again, we'll just run. It won't dare to keep bothering us." At the mention of Peeves, Hermione's breathing became much heavier, and she jumped up and down in anger. "I didn't do anything to it." "If it were reasonable, it wouldn't be called Peeves," Ethan continued. "Percy said Peeves is afraid of Barrow the Bloody, and if it keeps chasing you, you should shout Barrow's name." "I shouted," Hermione said, quite annoyed. "But it seemed to know I was trying to scare it." Ethan opened the classroom door and they quickly left together to have lunch in the auditorium. There were many young wizards in the Great Hall, including Harry and Ron. As soon as they saw them, they waved eagerly. "White. Granger. Over here." Ethan White picked up a chicken leg rice, a glass of pomegranate juice, a small steak and sausage, walked over, and asked with concern, "Did Professor McGonagall agree?" The two men's faces darkened, and they said with a hint of despair, "Professor McGonagall said she would only consider retracting her decision if there were no new late arrivals for at least 2 weeks." The three of them sighed in unison, their expressions not looking good. Hermione rolled her eyes and asked, "Potter, Weasley, can't you even get to class on time?" Ron quickly explained, "We were late this morning because Mr. Filch stopped us. If it weren't for him, we would have been in the classroom long ago." Harry nodded, looking quite dejected. "Besides," he said, "Ethan has to get up at 6 in the morning. What are we doing getting up so early? We can't even get into the Great Hall until 8. Ethan was equally listless. "You can familiarize yourself with the day's lessons in advance, review yesterday's lessons, and practice spells. You can actually do a lot of things." Suddenly, a bright, gleaming gaze appeared beside them. He turned his head and met Hermione's gaze. The little witch, who had been sullen the whole way, now seemed unusually cheerful. "The first class is at 9, but you get up at 6 in the morning. If you practice Transfiguration for 3 hours beforehand, you can definitely use it smoothly in class. Is that your secret to being amazing, White?" Hermione muttered to herself, a mixture of sudden realization and deep regret, nodding and shaking her head repeatedly. She looked at Ron and Harry, emphasizing, "You two really should get up at 6 in the morning to study. As for me, the clever Hermione Granger, I'll be getting up at 5:50 every day. No, 5:30. Hermione was overjoyed, completely forgetting the unpleasantness caused by Peeves earlier. Ethan thought for a moment. If she could really keep it up and her grades kept improving, then the professors would focus all their attention on Harry and her, and pay even less attention to him. This seems like a good thing for him. If you feel sleepy, you can drink some strong coffee. Ethan's eyes were full of encouragement. Ron and Harry stared in disbelief, a hint of fear lingering in their eyes. Ron whispered, "I told you, she's not quite right in the head." Ethan suddenly remembered something, looked at them, and winked, "By the way, did you all bring your acceptance letters?" Chapter 11. After lunch, in the boys' dormitory of Gryffindor, Ethan accepted the 2 acceptance letters. Exchange value, 1, mental resistance. Exchange value, 1, magic power. Ethan couldn't hide his surprise. It was originally just a sudden idea, but he never expected it to actually work. If you're randomly exchanging potential points, there's only a very small chance you'll get a special attribute. Only free potential points can be allocated 100% to rare attributes. The problem is that experience is very hard to accumulate. He calculated that even after a whole day of hard study, he could only earn about 30 experience points. Gaining an extra rare attribute can save you 10 days of hard work. Mental resistance +1. Magic +1. He examined the acceptance letter bearing the name Harry Potter closely, muttering, "Was this written by the headmaster himself?" Or was it just pure luck? Harry asked somewhat anxiously. White, what's wrong with my acceptance letter? Ethan snapped out of his reverie, placed the two acceptance letters side by side, and said softly, you see, the handwriting on these two is slightly different, but mine is exactly the same as Weasley's. Ethan took out his acceptance letter and placed it between the two acceptance letters. Ron stared wide-eyed, astonished. It really is different. Harry's acceptance letter looks more like, well, written by a man? Every letter is a bit messy. Harry pondered, maybe it's Hagrid? He gave me this acceptance letter himself. There have been many before, but Uncle Vernon confiscated them all. Ethan blinked, about to say something, when he heard Harry continue, it's a pity Uncle Vernon burned all those letters. Ha, what a short-tempered person. Harry wholeheartedly agreed. Just then, Neville returned, still holding the toad, and curiously approached, what are you looking at? Ron spoke first, we're looking at Harry's acceptance letter, and it's a little different from ours. Neville, where's yours? Ethan, standing to the side, secretly gave him a thumbs up in his mind. Neville stammered, the acceptance letter seems to be with my grandma. I often forget things, and I'm worried I'll lose it. Ethan was somewhat disappointed, but upon reflection, it was indeed something Neville would do. In their desire for him to become a wizard, his family even went so far as to throw him into the Black Lake, nearly drowning him. Ron's eyes lit up, and he quickly ran outside, calling out, Thomas, are your roommates back yet? Let me see your acceptance letters. Before long, several young wizards who had heard about it rushed in, each holding their acceptance letters. Harry, look at mine. A group of young wizards chattered excitedly as they spread the acceptance letter on the bed. Ethan kindly smoothed things out for them, and they quickly gained 2 points of mental resistance, 2 points of magic affinity, and 1 point of spell resistance. Rare attributes are ultimately low-probability events. Because Professor Phileas Flitwick, who teaches charms, is out and not home, the Charms class at 1:30 p.m. will be swapped with the Defense Against the Dark Arts class on Tuesday. The second period, Herbalism, will remain unchanged. A mouth-shaped envelope was making noise over and over again in the Gryffindor common room. Ethan grabbed his textbooks for 2 courses and hurriedly left with Harry, Ron, Hermione, Neville, and the others. The Defense Against the Dark Arts class is on the 4th floor, requiring climbing many stairs. The school has a total of 142 staircases. Some are wide and large, while others are narrow and small, and some are shaky. Some steps may suddenly disappear or change direction halfway up the stairs. That's why, as soon as they heard about the class change, a group of people immediately ran upstairs like they were being chased by dogs. Especially Ron and Harry, who were late once in the morning and had spoken with Professor McGonagall, knew that if they were late for the afternoon class again, Professor McGonagall would not believe them no matter what they said. However, the worry about being late was only one aspect. On the other hand, everyone had high expectations for this course. Because offensive magic can be learned in Defense Against the Dark Arts class. Learn how to use offensive magic to protect yourself from dark creatures and dark magic. In other words, the best defense is a good offense. A successful defense against dark magic is to defeat the enemy before they defeat me. Before class, Ethan translated the essence of Defense Against the Dark Arts, which drew laughter from many people. This class was for Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs together, without the pesky Slytherins. The atmosphere in the classroom was quite lively. The Hufflepuffs turned their curious gazes toward Gryffindor, or more precisely, to Harry Potter, the most famous freshman. Ethan, lurking in the corner, quietly observed them, lost in thought. He really wanted to look through all the new students' acceptance letters, but Slytherin would most likely ignore him, so the conventional method wasn't suitable. As for Ravenclaw, you could try asking Luna. Most of the young Ravenclaw wizards are loners and don't even talk to their own housemates. If he, a Gryffindor, rashly tries to borrow an acceptance letter, he'll most likely run into trouble. Only these quiet, obedient, honest, and upright Hufflepuffs should be relatively easy to talk to, like Hannah Abbott and Susan Bournes. The classroom door opened and closed silently, and then a strong smell of garlic filled the entire classroom. Many of the young wizards' expressions changed, and they immediately covered their noses. Even Ethan was affected, he held his breath from the fumes and almost vomited. This smell, a mixture of garlic and the sour stench of sweat, ferments into an unimaginably deadly odor. Professor Quirrell, the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, walked somewhat nervously to the podium. Ethan could hardly bear to look at it. No wonder it smells so bad with such a thick scarf wrapped around your neck in the middle of summer. It's just that Voldemort didn't have a nose, otherwise he would have either been suffocated by the stench or died from the fumes. This is everyone's first Defense Against the Dark Arts class. It was originally scheduled for Tuesday, but Professor Flitwick didn't get back to school in time and asked to switch classes with me. Quirrell avoided eye contact and explained in a weak, stammering tone. Ron covered his nose tightly and yelled, "Professor, why are you always wearing such a big scarf?" Quirrell quickly explained, "It's a complicated story. I helped an African prince get rid of a resurrected zombie, and this was a gift from him." Ron was even more annoyed, "He gave you a scarf that smelled like garlic." A low chuckle rang out. Professor Quirrell blushed slightly and hurriedly said, "I also banished a vampire in Romania, and to prevent its revenge, I stuffed some garlic in my scarf." Seamus hurriedly raised his hand and asked, "Professor, what spell did you use to defeat the resurrected zombie?" Everyone looked at him with great anticipation. Resurrected zombies are terrifying dark creatures, it would be perfect if the professor could use them as examples to teach spells. Professor Quirrell opened his mouth, his face flushed, and after hesitating for a while, he said, "The weather is very nice this afternoon, perfect for a walk. Now, please open your textbooks to the first page." A chorus of disappointed hisses immediately filled the classroom, but the young wizards obediently did as they were told and opened their textbooks. In the first section, we will learn what black magic is, its history, and its rise and fall. Chapter 12. I swear, if this is Defense Against the Dark Arts class, I'd rather listen to Professor Binns' lectures on the history of magic. Ron said with great disappointment, and the group of young wizards around him wholeheartedly agreed, voicing their complaints. So boring. Of the 7 required courses, History of Magic was generally considered the most boring, and Professor Binns' monotonous and tedious voice was exceptionally torturous. Unlike History of Magic, Defense Against the Dark Arts was the most anticipated course for young wizards because it taught them offensive magic to defend against dark magic. Who can resist the allure of summoning fire and lightning with a wave of a wand? But Professor Quirrell, all by himself, successfully changed the perceptions of all the young wizards. If Professor Binns' lectures were both boring and torturous, then Professor Quirrell's lectures were both hypnotic and painful, his voice was so soporific, and his garlic-smelling scarf and hat were excruciating. Ethan's expression was also not good. Although Professor Quirrell's skills were a bit lacking, he was still a proper professor. Even at his worst, he should have been more than capable of teaching a first-year wizard. But he was like a hypnotic repeater, reciting the textbook verbatim, not a word more, not a word less. It's like a heartless electronic voice reading from a thick dictionary, and it even smells like garlic. This resulted in Ethan gaining very little in the entire lesson, a stark contrast to Professor McGonagall's performance in the first lesson. If it's just about learning from textbooks, why don't I just read the books myself? Quirrell did it on purpose. Ethan left with the book. At that moment, he hated this guy from the bottom of his heart. There was no time for complaints, the young Gryffindor wizards hurried downstairs. Hogwarts' curriculum is quite intensive. If 2 classes are held consecutively, the break between them is only 15 minutes. Unfortunately, herbal medicine classes are held in the herbal medicine greenhouses, which are all located behind the school. There are 7 greenhouses in total, numbered from 1 to 7, with the higher the number, the more dangerous they are. The first-year wizards are going to greenhouse number 1. The class was taught by Professor Pomona Sprout, who was also the headmistress of Hufflepuff. Unlike the strict Professor McGonagall, she adored the Hufflepuff Badgers. This was a very kind witch. She smiled at everyone and announced loudly, "Before the formal classes begin, there are a few things you must remember. First of all, you are absolutely not allowed to remove any greenhouses other than greenhouse number 1. You might get lost and end up in greenhouse number 2, but you'd better not make that mistake. Because greenhouse number 2 is the home of the mandrake. The cry of an adult mandrake can be deadly. That's part of our second-year curriculum." The young wizards all looked terrified. Harry was even more uneasy, having recently gotten lost. The second thing, Professor Sprout said to everyone, "Before class, you must wear dragon skin gloves. The herbs we'll be caring for are all poisonous, even the youngest plants are enough to knock anyone out. In this lesson, we'll learn how to care for the hyena tree. Its leaves can trigger hysteria and uncontrollable laughter, and the honey produced by the heartworm is its antidote." As Ethan listened, he observed a small, dark, and thin plant in the flower pot in front of him. Its leaves were as small as a dog's paw and somewhat wrinkled. Professor Sprout wasn't fond of asking questions. She first explained the theory in one breath, then demonstrated it twice in its entirety, and then began to wander around the greenhouse, constantly correcting the young wizard's mistakes. Ethan knew the book A Thousand Wonderful Herbs and Mushrooms by heart, so there wasn't much difficulty in doing it. However, he wasn't in a hurry to finish it. Instead, he waited for Hermione to complete it successfully and receive the professor's praise before he would complete the steps of caring for the hyena tree. This lesson was fairly standard. Ethan gained a total of 9 experience points, which is less than Transfiguration, but 3 more than Defense Against the Dark Arts. Potions class was the last class of the day, and homework time was in the evening. Ethan gained a total of 11 plus 6 plus 9 equals 26 experience points in class today, 3 in the morning, and 5 in the library at noon, which met his expectations. However, Defense Against the Dark Arts severely hampered his progress. At the end of class, as instructed by the professor, each young wizard took 3 hyena tree leaves as a gift for their first herb class. A group of young Gryffindor wizards caught up with Ethan from behind. Harry looked at him nervously. "White? What are you going to do now?" Ethan looked around at them. Basically all the students from the academy were there, even the girls. He considered carefully before asking, "I'll do my homework, then maybe read a book, or maybe wander around the school. Do you need my help?" Harry seemed a little embarrassed and stammered. Ron said eagerly, "White, in this morning's Transfiguration class, only you and Granger successfully conjured a needle. We'd like to ask you for guidance. Professor McGonagall said she'll check before the next class, and if you still can't do it, you'll have to stand as punishment." The young wizards all looked terrified. They're still a bunch of fresh-faced new students. In a year or two, they'll probably stop taking this threat seriously. Of course. Ethan readily agreed, a warm smile spreading across his face. He turned to the other Gryffindors who hadn't yet shown him their acceptance letters and called out, "We're all Gryffindors, so naturally we should help each other. If you have any questions, come on over. Let's learn together. And beautiful ladies, don't be shy." The young men and women who had never spoken to Ethan before were immediately overjoyed. "Thank you, White. You're so kind, White." Ethan glanced quickly at Hufflepuff, where the little badgers were looking at them with great curiosity. Seeing their reaction, Ethan immediately understood. No transformation class today. He greeted them warmly, "Hufflepuffs, if you encounter any problems during tomorrow's Transfiguration class, feel free to come to me. I'll be happy to help. But please don't forget to bring your acceptance letters." "That's wonderful. Ron exclaimed excitedly. Harry, I knew White would say yes. Unlike Granger. Cough, cough, cough. Ethan hurriedly interrupted Ron, shouting even louder, we have herbalism class tomorrow afternoon, let's finish the homework the professor assigned first, then practice transfiguration. The carefree Ron exclaimed excitedly, great! Shall we go to the Great Hall then? After finishing our homework and having dinner, we can practice transfiguration right away. The other young wizards readily agreed, and together they walked arm in arm toward the auditorium on the first floor of the school. Anyway, the next transfiguration class is on Thursday, and with Ethan's help, there's plenty of time. Hermione, who was a little further away from them, looked at Ron with a puzzled expression. She thought she had just heard her own name called. Ethan glanced at the excited Ron every now and then, and sighed inwardly. Damn it, what a terrible teammate. Chapter 13. Hi, White, this is Parvati Petty. A little witch with long, jet-black hair stood before Ethan, her ember eyes filled with curiosity. Ethan took the acceptance letter she handed him, glanced at it quickly, nodded, closed it again, and handed it back. Magic affinity +1. Hello Petty, is there anything you don't understand? The corner of the Great Hall where the two were now located had become a study room for the Gryffindor Lion Cubs. Everyone waved their magic wands at the match. Ethan was responsible for clarifying doubts and correcting errors. Petty and another girl with fluffy, pink gold hair had just arrived, each holding an acceptance letter. It seems they are roommates with Hermione, but Ethan has never seen the three of them together. Petty lowered his head and flipped through his textbook, intending to show Ethan the parts he hadn't understood that morning. The blonde, blue-eyed little witch beside her waved her acceptance letter and asked in a crisp voice, Hi, White, I'm Lavender Brown. I'd like to know why you're looking at everyone's acceptance letters? Are you suspicious of something? Well, we noticed something unusual about the handwriting on Harry's acceptance letter, so I was wondering if we could find a second one with similar handwriting. Ethan said it in a very serious tone. Ron looked up and shouted, That's right, we're looking for a second special acceptance letter. The 11-year-old witch, clearly unaware of the wickedness of human nature, immediately handed the acceptance letter to Ethan, asking curiously, Am I special? Ethan took the letter with both hands, pointed to the name on it, smiled, and said, Of course, every acceptance letter is unique. Mental resistance +1. I don't know if she understood what it meant, but she was so happy that she kept touching her braids. White, I don't quite understand these parts. Pettier pointed to the basic principles of transfiguration. Ethan thought for a moment, then pointed to two empty seats and said, Sit down first, and I'll explain everything to you slowly. This is an exchange. He obtained random attributes from the acceptance letters, and in return, he taught them transfiguration in their first lesson. Ethan thought it was fair. He took out his notes from that morning, found the section on the principles of transfiguration, and said, I suggest you first copy my notes, along with some of my own understanding. After you've copied them, I'll demonstrate the specific transfiguration for you. Thank you, White. The two little witches immediately took out their quills. Ethan noticed that Harry had failed again and couldn't help but say, Harry, your magic is very strong. Try to relax a bit. Imagine the feeling of a stream flowing silently. Yes, that's it. Let the magic flow smoothly. Transfiguration is a delicate art, you must not rush it. Harry nodded nervously, grabbed a new match, and refocused. This time, the matchstick under Harry's wand successfully transformed, quickly turning into a gleaming silver needle. He couldn't help but cheer. Ron, standing nearby, widened his eyes in surprise. Unfortunately, in that moment of distraction, his wand burst into sparks, and the match instantly charred. Ron, having nothing better to do, exclaimed excitedly, Congratulations, Harry! You did it! If Harry can do it, he definitely can too. Harry smiled happily and looked at Ethan, who congratulated him and breathed a sigh of relief. That's great. As long as someone succeeds, it proves that what I taught is correct. That way, no matter who fails to produce the result, it can't be blamed on me. He smiled and was about to go over when suddenly, a message popped into his mind. Successfully guided the Silver Needle transformation technique, earning +3 experience points. Ethan abruptly stopped, his face filled with shock. After confirming several times that he wasn't mistaken, a chill ran down his spine. So that's how it can be done? If you can get 3 experience points for teaching someone. He subconsciously started counting heads, 1, 2, 3, 4, hiss, hiss. Meanwhile, Ron took out a new match and started practicing. Sitting in the corner, Simo once again exploded, turning his face black with soot. The group of people immediately started making a fuss. Simo! Be careful! Don't burn my eyebrows! Ethan strode over and said very enthusiastically. Ron, your wand is a bit difficult to control. I suggest you concentrate more. Unicorn hair is easier to control than phoenix feathers, you can unleash your magic more freely. Samer, you were too hasty. The match couldn't withstand your magic and that's why it exploded. You need to learn to control your magic, slow down, and relax. Naveen, why are you spacing out? Can't remember something again? Oh, don't cry, it's okay, you'll definitely learn it. More than 10 minutes later, Ron finally managed to conjure the needle. He immediately grinned from ear to ear. In fact, if his wand hadn't been so worn out, he could have done it much earlier. Successfully guided the Silver Needle transformation technique, earning +4 experience points. The third person to successfully conjure silver needles was Petier, which surprised everyone a little. This little witch had actually managed to do it just by looking at Ethan's notes. Successful guidance, experience +3. Ethan excitedly hugged Ron and then shook hands with Petier. Everyone was a little embarrassed, but they were all smiling. Ethan was so great, they were happy to have such a classmate by their side. They couldn't help but call each other by their first names and instantly became good friends. Finally, when the prefect came to take everyone back to their dorms, only Seamus and Neville were still struggling with the matches. Everyone else, including the 2 little witches, had successfully conjured silver needles. After all, it's just a very basic transformation technique. This also earned Ethan nearly 50 experience points. Combined with his own daily experience accumulation of almost 30 points, his efficiency is nearly 3 times what it used to be. It won't be long before he accumulates some free attribute points. It was as if a new door had opened before Ethan's eyes. On the way back to the dorm, Hermione appeared, carrying a thick hardcover book, looking at everyone with a puzzled expression except for Neville and Seamus. Everyone seemed happy. Hermione tugged at Ethan's sleeve, and Ethan had no choice but to slow down, falling behind with her. What are you doing? Hermione asked, puzzled. Even if you don't teach, Professor McGonagall will teach everyone next class. You've wasted your entire evening. Is it a waste? Not at all. Even if I studied all night, I wouldn't get 5 points of free attribute or an extra 50 experience points. Ethan grinned and said, Professor McGonagall was furious this morning. She said she'd check Ron and Harry's transfiguration before the next class, so of course I helped if I could. We're Gryffindor, you know, didn't you hear that rascal's hat singing? Their courage, boldness, and chivalry make Gryffindor stand out. I find it really good to be able to help others. Hermione rolled her eyes slightly but didn't pursue the matter further. She may not agree, but she should be able to understand. Your relationship has gotten so close that you call each other by name? You've only known each other for a day. Ethan smiled. As I said during the day, I don't believe friendship has to be tied to time. As long as we share the same values and respect each other. Miss Granger, we can also call each other by our first names, even if it takes 6 months. Hermione was speechless, and glared at him angrily. Ethan quickly added, "Could I take a look at your acceptance letter later? In return, if you need my help, just let me know." Of all the Gryffindor freshman acceptance letters, hers is the only one missing. Oh, and Neville's is there too, but Neville's acceptance letter is at home, and it might become useless after a while. Hermione pulled an acceptance letter from her sleeve and muttered, "What's so interesting about this?" Ethan was surprised to find that she had it on her person. He quickly took it, unfolded it, and looked at the neat handwriting on it. Intelligence +1. Miss Granger's acceptance letter surprisingly gave him a bit of intelligence. Chapter 14. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Ethan woke up on time. As his attributes improved, he felt great, his mind was very clear, and he was well suited to learning more complex knowledge. "Ron, Harry, wake up!" He hadn't forgotten Professor McGonagall's instructions, and very responsibly woke the two of them up. Ethan didn't leave until they were sitting on the bed, looking exhausted. Because of Professor Quirrell's slacker nature, Ethan has completely given up on him. This course may only be taught through self-study. In the empty classroom, Ethan opened Curses and Anti-Curses. This book contains many very useful spells, at least in his opinion, it is far more useful than Quirrell's. At my current level, should I learn defensive spells first? And control spells too? I'm quite weak right now, so it would be best to learn some spells suitable for ambushes. More than an hour later, Ethan picked up his wand and waved it in the air. He collapsed to the ground, completely unconscious. The ground is frozen and the weather is freezing. Cover your eyes and avoid looking. They'll all turn to petrification. Flames are raging. The curse of weak legs. Ethan tried many spells in succession, feeling utterly empty and overwhelmed with exhaustion. He put away his wand and let out a sigh. "Magic, I need magic." But don't worry, if everything goes smoothly, he might be able to meet Hufflepuff people today. As the number of people increases, his experience will also increase rapidly. Ethan smiled, took his book and wand, and left the empty classroom to have breakfast in the Great Hall. He ordered a chicken leg rice, a carrot, a roast beef, a cup of light tea, and a strawberry from the house elf. Luna sat opposite him, looking him up and down, and said in an ethereal voice, "Ethan, you don't look too good, but there are far fewer harassing flies than yesterday. Has the problem been resolved?" "I didn't keep track of the time while practicing spells just now," Ethan said happily. "But I'm definitely not as anxious as I was yesterday. I've noticed that everyone in Gryffindor is doing great." He glanced at her plate, an apple, a sandwich, a glass of milk, and a pudding. "Luna, did you bring your acceptance letter to the school?" "Naturally, my dad was worried that the school's harassing flies would attack people outside, so he always made me carry my acceptance letter with me to prove that I was a student at the school." Luna took out a piece of paper folded into a small triangle from her pocket, with her name written right in the center. "This is my talisman. Shall we exchange them if we'd like?" Ethan paused for a moment, then immediately took out his acceptance letter. He had been carrying it with him for the past 2 days to deal with aspiring wizards with similar requirements. He handed over the acceptance letter with both hands, and Luna handed over her amulet in return. Ethan took it, looked down at it, and saw that it was indeed a pass. The document was Luna's acceptance letter. Exchange value, 1, magic power. Ethan's eyes widened instantly, his breathing tightened, and his heart pounded. "Very nice." Luna looked at him in surprise. Ethan smiled and pointed to the little monster drawing above, saying, "It's beautifully drawn." Luna nodded, delighted. "These are curved-horned snoring beasts. They usually sleep in corners, but they often chatter on full moon nights, making them quite noisy. I will keep it safe." Ethan carefully put the triangular symbol away. 7 points of magic. A little elf brought him breakfast, a huge plate full, at least 3 times the size of Luna's. Looking at the mountain of food, Luna said, "My dad said that kids who eat a lot grow fast." That makes sense. Starving, Ethan didn't bother to talk and buried himself in his breakfast. Luna quickly finished her breakfast, waved to him, and said, "Goodbye, Ethan. We have Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration class with Hufflepuff this morning, she hates being late." "Goodbye, Luna. If you ever need help, feel free to ask me anytime." Luna nodded and skipped away. Ethan looked away, then suddenly realized something. It seemed that both Hermione and Luna were often alone. A brown-haired girl sat down listlessly across from her. Ethan smelled the aroma of coffee, and looking up in surprise, he saw Miss Hermione Granger looking sleepy. "Oh right, she said yesterday that she was going to get up at 5:30 today." He swallowed his food, wiped his mouth, and asked curiously, "How is it? How does it feel to get up early?" Hermione's face stiffened, but she said nonchalantly, "I've thought about it carefully, and 5:30 is still too early. Starting tomorrow, I'll get up at 6 o'clock too." As she spoke, she nervously wiped her mouth, where there seemed to be a trace of saliva. Ethan opened his eyes wider and could roughly guess that she must have gotten up too early and fallen asleep on her desk. He suppressed a laugh and nodded, "Adequate sleep is the foundation of everything." "Then what are you laughing at?" Hermione glared at him angrily, turned around, took out a handkerchief, and carefully wiped the corner of her eye. After she finished tidying up, the little elf brought her breakfast, a cream muffin, a glass of milk, a small piece of meat, and 2 fried eggs. "Good morning, Ethan, Granger." Harry and Ron arrived too, both looking